The machines in room 412 didn't beep with hope. They kept time for a dying man. 20 specialists had looked at the chart. 20 specialists had walked away. Detective Thomas Reed was fading into a medical anomaly. Then they let the dog in, and everything the experts knew changed. It started as a tremor. Just a slight, uncontrollable shaking in Thomas Reed's left hand as he filled out paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday night, he was running a fever of 104 degrees. By Friday, his kidneys were in active revolt, and the 210-pound narcotics detective was strapped to a bed in the intensive care unit of St. Jude's Medical Center, breathing through a plastic tube. He was 38 years old. He didn't smoke. He ran 5 miles a day. Now his skin possessed the pale, waxy sheen of a corpse left too long in the rain. Dr. Alan Harrison, the chief of critical care, stood at the foot of Reed's bed, staring at a tablet that offered nothing but bad news. Harrison had been practicing medicine for almost 3 decades. He had seen bodies crushed by steel, torn by bullets, and eaten from the inside by aggressive cancers. He understood the mechanics of death, but he hated a mystery. And Thomas Reed was a massive, frustrating mystery. "Run the toxicology screen again," Harrison said, his voice flat, devoid of the bedside manner he reserved for conscious patients. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, an infectious disease specialist with dark circles under her eyes, shook her head. "We've run it 3 times, Alan. Broad spectrum, heavy metals, synthetic opioids, ricin, arsenic. We even tested for rare botanical toxins because of that bust at the greenhouse last month. Nothing. His white blood cell count is through the roof, but cultures are negative. No bacteria, no viral load we can identify. It's like his body is fighting a ghost." Over the past 6 days, the hospital had thrown its entire arsenal at the detective. 19 other doctors had been consulted. Neurologists mapped his brain waves looking for prion diseases. Rheumatologists hunted for sudden-onset autoimmune disorders. Hematologists analyzed his marrow. One by one, they flipped through his increasingly thick chart, frowned, offered a highly educated guess, and prescribed treatments that did absolutely nothing. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, corticosteroids, plasmapheresis. Nothing worked. Reed's organs were shutting down in a slow, cascading domino effect. His liver enzymes were toxic. His heart rate would wildly spike to 160 beats per minute, then plummet into the low 40s. He was slipping away, right in front of a small army of the city's finest medical minds. Down in the hospital lobby, far away from the sterile hum of the ICU, Detective David Hayes sat on a vinyl chair that smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee. Hayes was Reed's partner. He had been sitting in that exact chair or pacing the perimeter of the waiting room for nearly 48 hours. Beside him sat Titan. Titan was an 85-pound German Shepherd K9. His black and tan coat was thick, his ears pinned sharply at attention, his amber eyes locked on the double doors that led to the elevators. Titan wasn't a pet. He was a piece of living tactical equipment, trained to detect narcotics, locate evidence, and take down men twice his size. Reed was his handler, his partner, his entire world. For the past week, Titan had been a wreck. Placed in the department kennels when Reed was first hospitalized, the dog had refused to eat. He paced his concrete run until his paws were raw, whining a low guttural sound that rattled the other handlers. Finally, Hayes had broken protocol, loaded the dog into the back of his cruiser, and brought him to the hospital. "Easy, buddy," Hayes muttered, resting a heavy hand on the dog's broad head. Titan didn't look at him. A low whine vibrated in the shepherd's chest. The dog's nose twitched, pulling in the sterile chemical scents of the hospital, sifting through the odors of rubbing alcohol, floor wax, and anxious sweat. He was looking for one specific scent profile. He was looking for Reed. Upstairs, the situation had escalated. The alarms in room 412 triggered, a sharp, piercing electronic scream that cut through the low murmur of the ward. Reed was seizing. Harrison and Jenkins rushed into the room, followed by a pair of critical care nurses. Reed's body bowed off the mattress, fighting the restraints. His eyes rolled back beneath half-closed lids. "Push 2 milligrams of Ativan," Harrison ordered, stepping forward to secure the detective's head. "Get another ice pack under his arms. His core temp is spiking again." It took 3 minutes to break the seizure. When Reed finally settled back into the damp sheets, his breathing was dangerously shallow. The ventilator pumped rhythmically, forcing air into lungs that were rapidly filling with fluid. Harrison stepped back, peeling off his latex gloves with a sharp snap. He looked at Jenkins. The unspoken truth hung heavily in the dry, conditioned air between them. They were out of options. They were out of guesses. They were just managing his descent now. "We need to call his next of kin," Harrison said quietly. "He doesn't have any," Jenkins replied, looking at the intake chart. "Parents are gone, not married. His emergency contact is his partner, Detective Hayes." Harrison scrubbed a hand over his face. The exhaustion was setting in, heavy and thick. "Go down there. Tell Hayes. Tell him it's time to come up. If he wants to say goodbye, he needs to do it tonight. He won't make it to morning." The automatic doors of the ICU slid open, a soft whoosh that usually signaled the arrival of fresh linens or another weary specialist. This time, the sound was followed by the sharp rhythmic click of heavy claws on linoleum. Hayes walked through the doors. His badge was clipped to his belt, his jaw tight, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. His right hand held a thick leather leash. At the end of that leash was Titan. The nurse's station went entirely still. In the meticulously controlled environment of an intensive care unit, an 85-pound canine was the equivalent of a hand grenade. Dr. Harrison stepped out of room 412, a clipboard in his hand. He stopped dead in his tracks. "Detective, what are you doing? You cannot bring a dog in here. This is a sterile environment." "He's dying, Doc," Hayes said, his voice carrying a gravelly, uncompromising edge. He didn't stop walking. He moved past the central desk, pulling Titan alongside him. "You told me he's not making it to morning. You told me you don't know what's killing him. So the dog says goodbye." "Detective, I understand you're grieving, but this violates every sanitation protocol." "Arrest me," Hayes shot back, finally stopping inches from the doctor. The raw grief in the detective's eyes made Harrison pause. "Go ahead. Call hospital security. Call the uniforms in the lobby. By the time they get up here and drag me out, Titan will have seen his partner." Harrison looked down. Titan wasn't behaving like a frantic pet. The dog was perfectly composed. He was in a tight heel, sitting automatically when Hayes stopped. But the shepherd's amber eyes were fixed intensely on the glass wall of room 412. The dog's nose was working frantically, drawing in rapid, shallow breaths. He smelled it. Beneath the bleach, the saline, the ozone of the machines, Titan smelled Thomas Reed. Harrison sighed, a long, defeated sound. He was too tired to fight. The patient was dying anyway. 5 minutes, the doctor muttered. Don't let him touch any of the central lines. Hayes nodded once, a tight jerk of his chin. He pushed open the heavy glass door of room 412. The heat hit them first, followed by the heavy, sweet scent of sickness. The room was dominated by the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator. Reed lay motionless, a tangle of wires and tubes sprouting from his chest, his arms, his mouth. He looked small, diminished. Hayes unclipped the lead from Titan's heavy leather collar. Go to him. Titan didn't jump on the bed. He didn't lick Reed's face or whine for attention. Instead, the dog's demeanor shifted entirely. The subtle relaxation of his posture vanished. His spine stiffened. His ears swiveled, locking forward. He entered his work mode. To a working canine, the world is not visual. It is olfactory. A human walks into a room and sees a bed, a monitor, a dying man. Titan walked into the room and stepped into a complex three-dimensional web of odors. He smelled the decaying red blood cells. He smelled the heavy metallic tang of the antibiotics. He smelled the specific sweat of a body operating in extreme distress. But he smelled something else, too. Dr. Jenkins had entered the room, standing quietly in the corner. She watched with a mix of clinical detachment and human pity as the massive dog approached the bed. Titan moved methodically. He stood on his hind legs, placing his front paws gently on the metal bed rail, careful not to touch the patient. He began at Reed's feet. He dragged his dark muzzle through the air inches above the blanket, pulling the scent molecules into his nasal cavity, analyzing them with a biological computer millions of times more sensitive than any machine in the hospital. He moved up Reed's left leg. Nothing. Over the hips. Nothing. What is he doing? Jenkins whispered. Is he searching? He's an evidence and chemical detection dog, Hayes replied softly, watching intently. He knows Tommy's baseline scent. He knows something is wrong. Titan moved up the right side of the bed. He passed Reed's hand. He passed the heavy bandages on the detective's arm where the IV lines were secured. He reached the thick, rigid cervical collar around Reed's neck, a precaution from the initial admission when they suspected a spinal infection due to the muscle tremors. Titan stopped. The dog's ears twitched. He leaned closer to the plastic and foam collar. He inhaled deeply, a loud, snorting sound. He exhaled. He inhaled again, zeroing in on a space no wider than a quarter, right behind Reed's right ear, where the thick foam of the brace pressed tightly against the hairline. Suddenly, Titan dropped down to all fours. He sat rigidly on the linoleum. He stared directly at the right side of Reed's head. And then he barked. It wasn't a playful yip. It was a sharp, booming, authoritative sound that echoed off the tile walls and made both doctors flinch. It was an alert, a hard, definitive alert. "Quiet, Titan," Hayes hissed, stepping forward. But Titan didn't move. He barked again, raising his right paw and scratching frantically at the air in the direction of the cervical collar. He was indicating. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. What does that mean? Why is he doing that? Hayes stared at the dog, the blood draining from his face. He found something. That's his aggressive alert. He only does that when he hits on a target chemical. Synthetic narcotics, accelerants, toxic compounds. That's impossible, Jenkins said, shaking her head. We washed him. We scrubbed him with chlorhexidine when he was admitted. We did a full-body assessment. Did you take the collar off? Hayes demanded, his voice rising, cutting through the sterile quiet. Harrison and Jenkins looked at each other. The realization hit them simultaneously. "He was combative during admission," Harrison said, his words coming out in a rush. "Severe tremors. We placed the collar to prevent cervical spine injury. We cleared his spine on the CT scan, but his vitals were crashing so fast, we left it on to stabilize his airway for intubation." "Take it off," Hayes ordered. It wasn't a suggestion. Harrison didn't argue. He moved to the top of the bed. With clinical precision, he undid the heavy Velcro straps holding the rigid plastic in place. He carefully peeled the front half away, then gently lifted Reed's head to slide the back panel out. Titan whined, leaning forward, his nose practically touching the doctor's wrist. Harrison grabbed a high-powered pen light from his breast pocket. He clicked it on, shining the harsh white beam directly onto the skin behind Reed's right ear, deep into the thick, dark hair at the base of the skull. The doctor gasped, instinctively recoiling a half step. "Jenkins," Harrison breathed, his voice suddenly tight with adrenaline. "Get a biohazard kit, now!" Dr. Harrison did not move. He held the pen light perfectly steady, the sharp beam illuminating a nightmare hidden in plain sight. Buried deep in the thick hair at the base of Detective Reed's skull, resting flush against the skin and previously shielded by the rigid plastic of the cervical collar, was a bloated gray mass. It was the size of a swollen Concord grape, its surface taut and faintly translucent. Surrounding the mass was a brutal, jagged ring of blackened, necrotic flesh. "Forceps," Harrison said. His voice was a flat, tight wire. "Longnose, now!" Dr. Jenkins ripped open a sterile tray, her hands moving with frantic precision. She handed the heavy steel tweezers across the bed. "Do not squeeze the abdomen," Jenkins warned, leaning in close, her eyes wide behind her safety glasses. "If you compress it, you'll push the stomach contents directly back into his bloodstream." "I know how to extract a tick, Sarah," Harrison muttered, though the sweat gathering on his brow betrayed his calm tone. This was no ordinary woodland tick. It was massive, a grotesque parasite that had spent the better part of a week gorging itself on the detective's blood. Harrison clamped the cold steel of the forceps down as close to Reed's skin as mathematically possible, pinching the tiny, buried head of the arthropod. He applied slow, steady, upward pressure. The skin tented, resisting the pull. The room fell into absolute silence. The only sounds were the mechanical hiss of the ventilator and the ragged, shallow breathing of Detective Hayes. With a sickening, wet pop, the parasite came free. Harrison dropped the engorged creature into a clear plastic specimen cup. Jenkins instantly snapped the lid shut. "Look at the bite site," Harrison ordered, shining the light back onto Reed's neck. Where the tick had been anchored, the flesh was literally dissolving. A highly localized patch of cellular death, weeping a foul, dark fluid. The parasite hadn't just been drinking blood. It had been continuously pumping a potent cocktail of saliva, neurotoxins, and digestive enzymes directly into the vascular highway leading straight to Reed's brain stem. Titan, still sitting rigidly on the linoleum, let out a long, heavy exhale through his nose. He lowered his paw. The threat had been identified. The K9 broke his aggressive, alert posture, turning in a tight circle before dropping to his belly, his head resting on his front paws, his amber eyes never leaving his handler. "Get that thing to the lab," Harrison told Jenkins, pointing at the plastic cup. "I want an entomologist on a video call in 5 minutes. I want to know exactly what species that is, what part of the world it comes from, and what pathogens it naturally carries. Go." Jenkins sprinted from the room. Hayes stared at the weeping wound on his partner's neck. "How did you miss that?" he asked. The anger in his voice was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow shock. "The admission was chaotic," Harrison replied, already drawing a syringe of localized broad-spectrum antibiotic to inject directly into the necrotic margin. "He was seizing. We suspected a spinal cord infection. We placed the collar to stabilize him before intubation, and protocol dictates we don't remove a stabilizing brace until the patient is neurologically cleared. We gave him sponge baths, but the nurses worked around the foam to maintain airway security." The doctor looked down at the German Shepherd. "We missed it because human beings rely on protocol and visual scans. The dog doesn't." Down in the pathology lab, the puzzle pieces violently snapped together. The entomologist on the emergency consult took one look at the high-resolution images Jenkins transmitted and swore loudly. It was an Ixodes holocyclus, an Australian paralysis tick. But it was carrying a secondary rider, a highly aggressive, exotic bacterial strain endemic only to deep canopy rainforests. The greenhouse bust, Hayes realized, standing in the doorway of the lab an hour later. He dragged a hand down his exhausted face. Last month, a syndicate was smuggling raw coca paste inside shipments of illegal exotic orchids from South America, routed through the Pacific. Tommy was the one who crawled through the humidifiers to find the stash boxes. He must have picked it up then. The tick had embedded itself. Because of the specific neurotoxin it secreted, the bite was entirely painless. It sat there, hidden beneath Reed's hairline, slowly injecting a paralyzing agent that mirrored a catastrophic autoimmune failure, while simultaneously dumping an exotic bacteria into his system that sent his white blood cell count into overdrive. It was a perfect biological storm, and Titan had smelled it. The K9 wasn't just trained to find cocaine or heroin. During his agricultural contraband certification, he had been exposed to hundreds of chemical markers, including the specific terpene profiles of smuggled exotic flora. The tick, having lived its entire life cycle within those illegal orchids, carried that exact faint chemical signature. Combined with the distinct rotting odor of the necrotic tissue hidden under the collar, Titan's olfactory bulb had processed what 20 medical degrees had failed to see. Back in room 412, the medical strategy pivoted instantly. They weren't fighting a ghost anymore. They had a target. Harrison discontinued the heavy, useless immunosuppressants. He ordered an immediate course of targeted antiparasitics and a massive, continuous infusion of doxycycline and to annihilate the bacterial infection. By 4 a.m., the neurotoxin supply had been cut off for 6 hours. The heart monitor, which had been erratic and terrifying for nearly a week, settled into a steady, rhythmic, boring pattern. The fever began to break. The sheets beneath Reed were soaked with sweat, but his skin lost that terrible, waxy sheen. The flush of circulating oxygen returned to his face. Dr. Harrison stood by the IV pole, charting the sudden, dramatic drop in liver enzymes. He looked from the digital readouts to the massive dog sleeping silently under the window. Harrison had authored a dozen papers in peer-reviewed medical journals. He understood the complex pharmacology of the human body better than almost anyone in the state. But as he watched the monitor confirm that Detective Thomas Reed was going to survive the night, the doctor realized that the most sophisticated diagnostic tool in the hospital was currently snoring on the linoleum floor. The withdrawal of a mechanical ventilator is not a gentle process. It is a violent, necessary eviction. 3 days after the extraction, room 412 looked entirely different. The blinding overhead fluorescents were dimmed. The chaotic swarm of crash carts and infusion pumps had been pushed to the perimeter. The air still smelled of sterile wipes and saline, but the heavy, oppressive scent of impending death had vanished. Thomas Reed was fighting his way back to the surface. Dr. Harrison stood over the bed, a suction tube in his hand. "All right, Tom, I know you can hear me. The paralysis agent is mostly metabolized. You're going to feel a severe pressure in your throat. You need to cough. Force it out." Reed's eyes were open, bleary and bloodshot, tracking the movement in the room with sluggish confusion. His massive chest heaved against the straps. Harrison deflated the cuff on the endotracheal tube. "Cough! Now!" He pulled. Reed gagged, his body arching off the mattress as the long-ribbed plastic tubing was dragged out of his trachea. He choked, spitting a thick wad of mucus into the towel Jenkins held ready. Reed collapsed back into the pillows, gasping for air. It sounded like gravel in a blender. Every breath was a ragged, burning victory. He blinked, the harsh light stinging his corneas. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords, bruised and swollen from a week of mechanical invasion, refused to cooperate. He managed a dry, clicking rasp. "Don't try to talk," Hayes said. The partner was sitting in the same vinyl chair he had occupied for the better part of 10 days. He looked 10 years older. He held a plastic cup of ice chips, spooning one out and pressing it past Reed's cracked lips. Reed let the ice melt, the freezing water a shock to his raw throat. He swallowed, wincing. He looked at Hayes. Then, his eyes darted around the room. The confusion deepened into a sudden, sharp panic. His right hand twitched, reaching weakly toward the edge of the bed. He was looking for his anchor. "He's here," Hayes said softly. "Calm down. He's right here." Hayes whistled, a low, sharp, two-note command. From the corner of the room, behind a privacy curtain, Titan stepped out. The hospital administration had completely surrendered. After Dr. Harrison's blistering threat to resign if anyone dared attempt to remove the animal from his ICU, security had looked the other way. Titan had practically lived in the corner of room 412, eating from a plastic basin Hayes brought in, sleeping with his nose pointed toward the bed. Titan didn't rush. He didn't jump. He walked with a heavy, deliberate, professional gait. He approached the right side of the bed, the same side where he had made his discovery. He sat. Reed's heavy, bruised hand slipped off the mattress, dangling over the metal rail. Titan pushed his broad, dark head directly upward, pressing the top of his skull firmly into Reed's open palm. The dog let out a long, shuddering sigh, the tension of the past 10 days finally leaving his muscular frame. He didn't lick. He didn't whine. He just applied deep, grounding pressure against his handler's hand. Reed's fingers weakly curled into the thick fur behind the K9's ears. Tears, hot and unbidden, tracked sideways down the detective's face, soaking into the thin hospital pillow. He didn't wipe them away. "You missed a hell of a party, Tommy," Hayes said, leaning back in his chair, a cynical smirk finally breaking through the exhaustion on his face. 20 specialists told me to start picking out a cheap suit for your funeral. Turns out, you just needed a flea bath." Reed let out a sound that was half laugh, half cough, grimacing in pain. He squeezed Titan's fur. The dog leaned harder into the touch. Harrison stood near the door, watching the interaction. He checked the chart one last time. Blood pressure was normalizing. White count was dropping steadily. The necrotic wound on the neck was clean and granulating beautifully under the targeted antibiotics. The patient was out of the woods. Jenkins walked up beside him, holding a fresh stack of lab results. "It's a miracle his organs didn't sustain permanent damage from the hypoperfusion," she murmured, looking at the man and his dog. "We were hours away from systemic failure." "It wasn't a miracle, Sarah," Harrison said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual clinical arrogance. He clipped his pen to his breast pocket. "It was arrogance. We trusted the machines. We trusted the data. We forgot that we are essentially just biology. And sometimes biology understands biology a hell of a lot better than a CT scanner." Harrison walked over to the bed. He checked the IV lines, adjusting a valve on the saline drip. He looked down at Titan, who watched the doctor's hands carefully, making sure the human wasn't hurting his handler. "Detective," Harrison said, his tone authoritative, but warm. "You're going to be here for another week. The physical therapy is going to be brutal. Your muscles have atrophied, and the neurotoxin did a number on your nervous system. It's going to hurt." Reed looked up at the doctor, then down at the heavy weight resting under his right hand. He managed a weak, lopsided smile. He squeezed Titan's fur again. He didn't need to speak. The message was clear. He had his partner. He had his life. He could handle the rest. The machines in room 412 hummed, but they were no longer keeping time for a dying man. They were just background noise to a quiet, profound reunion. If this story of Titan's incredible loyalty and Detective Reed's miraculous survival hit home for you, don't keep it to yourself. Drop a like to honor the working dogs who put everything on the line, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the strongest bonds go beyond words. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into true stories of resilience, survival, and the unbreakable human-animal connection.